Hello, welcome back to Wednesday Word. Thank you, as always, for joining me. And as you know, if you've been with me, we are right in the middle of our study of Isaac and Jacob as we continue to look at the patriarchs who became the foundation for the nation of Israel, from whom ultimately Jesus Christ would come. And if you were with me last time specifically, you know that we saw Jacob the deceiver become totally deceived himself in a plot that was certainly, it had to include Leah. There was a bride swap on the wedding night that Laban, of course, instigated. We know that. He had to. And I'll be honest, I've thought a lot of times about Leah's role. She knew exactly what was happening. And what about Rachel? I mean, what did Laban tell his younger daughter so that she accepted that arrangement? And we know enough about the relationship between Rachel and Leah. It was contentious. It was racked with jealousy. There had to be some, of course, a man's word was pretty much whatever he said went, but Rachel could not have been happy about that arrangement. In any case, we saw Jacob deceived. We got Leah becoming his first wife. He never wanted to marry Leah. That was plain from the very beginning. We know that Laban attempted to justify his deceitful actions by saying, well, I couldn't allow the younger daughter to marry before her older sister. It's just not done in our culture. And that may have been true, but it was still deceitful. So Jacob has a wife he doesn't really love, not the way he should have before the marriage. And of course, even when I say that, I hesitate because so many marriages were arranged, all of them really. And so I'm sure it was not that uncommon for there to be no affection prior to marriage, but this situation seems a little harder than some. I read you the scripture last week in Leviticus where God forbade the kind of marriage arrangement that Laban put these people into by giving Jacob Leah first, and then right on the heels of that, giving him Rachel as his wife. So Leah's not the favored wife. She's not loved like Rachel is, so God opens her womb. And the first thing we see is very quickly, she has 4 sons in a row. For Jacob, the first of his 12 sons. She named the first one Reuben, and it meant, behold a son, or he has seen my misery. So much is revealed to us by the names that she gives her children, all of those children, in fact. And Leah's justification was, the Lord has surely looked on my affliction. Now, therefore, my husband will love me because I've given him a son. Why wouldn't he love me now? She named the second son Simeon, which means he has heard or God has heard, because she believed that God realized that she wasn't loved as her sister was loved and had given her this second son to vindicate her. Then, of course, there was a third son named Levi, and we know that Levi would become the priestly tribe. And the word Levi, the name Levi, means joined or connected, because Leah believed that her husband would be connected to her, feel that intimate bond with her, because now she's given him 3 sons. That statement in and of itself is full of pathos as her heart cried out to be loved by Jacob. And then along came son number 4, and she named that son Judah, which means praise or thanksgiving, because at that point, her source of joy, her source of of praise, if you will, was the fact that she was producing these children, believing her husband would love her, and giving some credit to God for his favor in that process. We know that Judah would become the tribe through which Jesus Christ, the Lion of Judah, would come. And oddly enough, after Judah was born, Leah temporarily stopped bearing children. Now, during all this time, watching her sister have 4 babies, we do know that to have those 4 babies, well, at the very least, 4 or 5 years have passed. So there's been an extensive amount of time. The culture is very unforgiving toward a woman who can bear no children. So Rachel is certainly suffering emotionally and in terms of how she believes that she is perceived in her world in that day. And she is full of jealousy for her sister. She envies the children that she has been able to produce. But here's what's unreasonable. She blames Jacob. Now, there's no way Jacob can be blamed for Rachel being unable to conceive. I mean, obviously he can produce children. She just can't have children herself. And so, I don't know. Some actually believe that Jacob's attitude toward Leah played a role in the fact, and probably it did, the fact that she was able to have those children because God showed her mercy. And it's interesting because in that same time frame, I told you last time that neither one of those women had children immediately. The scriptures suggest that at some point we have 2 women, neither of which have had a baby, and God opens Leah's womb, suggesting that Rachel's is not opened in that same time frame. So in her desperation, Rachel gives Jacob the maid that Laban had given her when she got married, and her name was Bilhah. And she gives this maid to Jacob as wife number 3. Because she says, Bilhah will bear a child for me on her knees. Because culturally at that time, if you gave a servant to the master of the household as a wife, the mistress of the household could claim those children as if they were her own. So Bilhah conceives, bears son number 5 to Jacob, and Rachel names him. She names him Dan, which means he judged or judgment. So God has judged this situation and finally found me worthy to have a child, and this is my child through my maidservant. Wow. Bilhah has a second son. His name, again, coming from Rachel, was Naphtali, which means my struggle and my wrestling. And Rachel says, I have wrestled greatly. I've wrestled with my sister, and I have finally prevailed. Oh my goodness. Here again, the contention between these 2 sisters who never should have been married to the same man. Now, with that kind of rivalry, there is no surprise when Leah is going to step up and do whatever she has to make sure that children are still being produced through her branch of the family for Jacob. So that is where we find ourselves today in Genesis chapter 30, verses 9 through 24. And it's a little bit lengthy, so stay with me. When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob as wife. Mercy. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "A troop comes." So she called his name Gad. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, "I am happy, for the daughters will call me blessed." So she called his name Asher. Now Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field, and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" Note that question. So when Jacob came out of the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I surely hired you with my son's mandrakes." Mercy, Lord. And he lay with her that night, and God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, "God has given me my wages, because I have given my maid to my husband." So she called his name Issachar. Then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. And Leah said, "God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons." So she called his name Zebulun. Afterward she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son and said, "God has taken away my reproach." So she called his name Joseph and said, "The Lord shall add to me another son." Okay, so when Leah decides she's not going to have more children, or it appears that she's not going to, she takes a page straight from Rachel's playbook, and she gives her maid Zilpah to Jacob as his wife, number 4. I have to stop here. We've already discussed it. That was never God's plan. It was common in ancient times, but it was never God's plan. God intended one man for one woman for one lifetime. Boy, we have fouled that concept up by loving and leaving, switching and changing. Never what God intended. So Zilpah also bears a son for Jacob, and as Rachel named her maid's children Bilhah, now Leah names this child born to Zilpah, and she names him Gad. And it means fortune or good fortune, because she said a troop comes. In other words, she is acknowledging that between her children and the children of her maid, now there are a bunch of them, and certainly Jacob will favor them. That's what her mind is telling her. Her maid has a second son, and she names that son, Leah names that son Asher, meaning happy and blessed. So she's happy, Leah is, because she thinks that the women of her culture would call her blessed because of so many children born to her and to her through her maid. Now, at that point, the text takes a shift. It's almost like there's a detour topic brought in, because Reuben has gone into the field. It is wheat harvest time, so it's late spring. And he finds mandrakes in the field. Now, that word means absolutely nothing to us, but mandrakes were a plant that produced a fruit-like harvest or product, and some say they were somewhat like avocados, and in some cultures they were considered to be an aphrodisiac. something that would induce fertility, and popularly at that time in history, they were called love apples. Some people thought they were like a love charm. Historically, we're told that they were a tuberous plant with a yellow plum-like fruit. So I've heard them compared to avocados. I've heard them compared to plums in doing research. In any case, they ripen in May, which fits with that time frame of wheat harvest. So that makes good sense there. Now, we already understand this fruit in and of itself is not going to cause anybody to be able to conceive a child. That's ludicrous. That's superstitious. That's not going to happen. And certainly Rachel is not acting based in faith in God alone. She seems to have forgotten for the moment that only God can help her. So we wonder if on some level, if she's given up on the idea that God is going to allow her to have children. In any case, she asked Leah for some of these mandrakes that have been found in the field during this time of wheat harvest. And so she wants some. Reuben found them, so he obviously goes straight to his mom with them, and Rachel wants them. Notice Leah's retort there. It's really, again, it shows the level of hurt in her life. I mean, isn't it enough that you took my husband from me? Which basically says you didn't take his presence, you took his heart from me. And she says, now do you want to take my son's mandrakes too? But Rachel wants them. In response, we get the impression that given a preference and no obligation elsewhere, that Jacob would have gravitated to Leah's tent. And I remind you that it was very common for there to be separate tents. We see references early on to Sarah's tent, to Leah's tent or Rachel's tent. So that was not uncommon, but we see that Jacob's attentions are actually being bartered or sold for some fruit. And the bargain is that Rachel gets some mandrakes and Leah gets Jacob for that evening. Now, when Jacob comes out of the field, imagine his surprise when Leah meets him and says, hey, I've hired you for the evening. You come stay with me. I traded some of my son's mandrakes for you. That is strange. In any case, Jacob does spend that evening with Leah, and God again listens to her, and she conceives and bears son number 5 that she produced herself for Jacob, and his name is Issachar, and it means man of hire, or there is a reward. The idea is God has compensated me, given me my wages. That name actually means God had given. So I gave mandrakes away. I've been a faithful wife. I've produced children. And so I've gotten a reward I deserve. Okay. So she attributes the favor that has been shown to her to the fact that God has given her wages that she deserved. After all, she gave her maid to her husband. She produced 2 children, and she has given Jacob 5 children. Okay, she conceives again, and son number 6 is born. His name is Zebulun, and it means gift from God, honor, sacrifice, dwelling. So she now has had 6 sons herself. She's not going to produce any more sons, but she does have a daughter named Dinah. And this is not the last time we will hear Dinah's name in this story. Okay, so think about this for a second. Leah produces 6 of the 12 sons of Jacob herself. Her maid produces 2. So that means technically 8 of the 12 come from Leah and her maid. Wow. God did favor her in that regard. But at this point, God does remember Rachel. And she finally produces a son. Her sister has had 6 sons, and there was a gap between the first 4 and the last 2. So we know that in time frame, because her maid had 2 sons in the gap. So we're looking at least 8 or 10 years, probably more time frame here, plus the time at the beginning when neither sister had any babies. Maybe 10 or 12 years or more that Rachel has been barren in her marriage. And God remembers her. And she bears a son to Jacob and names this baby Joseph, meaning to add, or God shall add, or together. Now, in that name, we hear the heart of this woman. God has finally opened my womb. I've had a son, and God's going to give me more children. That's what she believes, that God would add more to this first baby that has been born. Okay, so now Jacob has 11 children. 2 primary wives and 2 secondary wives. He's got a big family. He's still in Padanaram. He's still technically employed by Laban, and his problems with Laban and his tendency to be deceitful are not over. That takes us back to our text, Genesis 30, verses 25 through 34. And it came to pass, when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away, that I may go to my own place, to my country, and give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know my service which I have done for you." I've worked hard for you, Laban. And Laban said to him, "Please stay, if I have found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake." Then he said, "Name me your wages, and I will give it." So Jacob said to him, "You know how I have served you, and how your livestock has been with me. For what you had before I came was little, and it has increased to a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming, and now when shall I also provide for my own house?" So he said, "What shall I give you?" That's Laban. And Jacob said, "You shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flocks. Let me pass through all your flocks today, removing from there all the speckled and spotted sheep, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and these shall be my wages. So my righteousness will answer for me in time to come, when the subject of my wages comes before you. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and brown among the lambs will be considered stolen if it is with me." And Laban said, "Oh, that it were according to your word." So he removed that day the male goats that were speckled and spotted, all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had some white in it, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and gave them into the hands of his sons. He put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. Now, the pronouns in that section are a little confusing, so let me make sure that we get all that straight. Okay, Jacob's got a big family. He has a lot of people to support, but he owns nothing. Let me make that crystal clear. If he were to leave Padanaram at this point on this day when he has asked Laban to let him go, he would basically leave with nothing but his wives and his children. So now that Joseph's been born and he's got 11 kids, he has asked to return home to his own country. In that request, he makes it plain. Look, Laban, I have served you. I've served you faithfully. Any debt for my wives that I would have owed to you has well been paid. Now, at this point, he's been with Laban 14 years. And that's a long time. And he still has nothing but these women and all the children they've produced. But Laban doesn't want Jacob to leave. I mean, he says, look, I don't want you to leave me. There's a really good reason why he does not want Jacob to leave. Even though Jacob has acquired no property to speak of during this time, that's not true for Laban. His wealth has drastically increased because of the favor that rested on Jacob's life. That reminds us of Jacob in the house of Potiphar. Joseph in the house of Potiphar, because God's favor rested on Joseph. So everything he did in Potiphar's household was blessed. Well, everything Jacob's doing here is blessed. So Laban's wealth is drastically increasing. Now, verse 27 helps us a little bit to understand again why Laban is so reluctant to release Jacob. Verse 27 says, and Laban said to him, please stay if I have found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by the New King James Version says experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. Then he said, name me your wages and I will give it. Now the word experience does not help us to understand what's really happening here. Laban claims in this statement that he has received some sort of special or revelation knowledge related to Jacob and the service that Jacob has provided for his uncle Laban. Now, if we go to a modern version, let's go to the English Standard Version and read that same verse 27. But Laban said to him, if I have found favor in your sight, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. So he's been divining. That would be like saying, I used a crystal ball, or I let somebody read my palm. He's saying that supernaturally he has received revelation that Jacob is bringing favor on his household. Okay, I have to stop right here. It's interesting to note that he thinks this knowledge was revealed to him through divination. Obviously associated with his household idols, and as if they could reveal something to him. Now, I have to acknowledge here that there are times and there are certain people who can receive knowledge that they couldn't acquire through a normal human means. Can't look it up in a dictionary. Nobody uses a dictionary anymore, but you couldn't. You can't Google it. You can't go on to the internet and find it. So how would people get that kind of knowledge? Now, in all honesty, demonically things can be revealed. But just the fact that you don't get that kind of information from God automatically makes it wrong. Automatically makes going to that kind of source wrong. People sell their souls for the ability to do that. Now, most people who claim to provide information from the other world or connections to the other world are charlatans. They're just cheating you. But there are people who are demonically empowered who can do things. But don't kid yourself. Dabbling with that kind of stuff is extremely dangerous. It is forbidden. Scripture forbids it, and we need to avoid it. I don't care if it's tarot cards or a Ouija board or whatever it is. It's wrong. So Laban is basically claiming that something has been revealed to him in association probably with his household gods. That's the statement he's making here. So he does not want Jacob to leave. He wants Jacob to remain in his service. And he says, hey, Jacob, name your wages. You name it. You pick it. I'll be all for it. Jacob again affirms that he has been faithful in his service to Laban. And he says, look, when I arrived, you had little. And now what you have is a great amount. God has blessed you in the 14 years I've been here. Your wealth has drastically increased. You need to understand that the source of those blessings is God. That most definitely it's God's favor that has brought that kind of increase of wealth. But Jacob tacks on a very important question. And now, when shall I also provide for my own house? Hey, I've got to shift gears here. I have a large family for which I am responsible to provide. Now, Jacob's question is not only relevant, it's important. Because Scripture makes it clear that a man should provide for his household. 1 Timothy 5:8 says, but if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. King James says an infidel. So Laban asked again in an isolated question, what shall I give you? What do I have to give you to get you to agree to stay? Because your presence and your service benefits me. Now, Jacob's response to that question is not what we would expect someone to say. He actually appears to offer to take the least desirable animals from the flock as his pay. They're also the animals that would be easy to identify. No one would be able to argue about which group, his or Laban's, those animals should belong in. They would stand out. They would be easy to recognize. Therefore, they would be easy to defend if Jacob was accused of stealing. So, what do we need to know? In Syria, which is where he is, what we know is Syria, the animals were not exactly colored as we would expect today. The goats were black and the sheep were white. So Jacob offers to take the sheep that are not white, but are speckled and spotted, or lambs that are brown. He offers to take the goats that are not black, but are speckled and spotted, unusual in their coloring. And everything else, he says, Laban, will be yours. The ones that are born and they are colored the way we would typically expect them to be, they'll be all yours. So doing that 2 estates would be built at the same time. Laban's with black and brown animals, with black goats and white sheep, and Jacob's with the animals that are unusually colored. So Jacob thought to himself, maybe I can prevent disputes. Now we know Laban better than that, because what Laban says and what Laban does are not exactly the same thing. We see Laban appear to agree to his terms, but obviously it makes sense that even Jacob would have been on guard. That day, not Jacob, but Laban went through the herds and separated the male and female goats that were speckled and spotted or had white on them, the brown lambs, and placed those animals in the care of his sons. And he placed them a distance about 3 miles from the rest of the herd. Now, what he's doing is, his mind says, if they're speckled or spotted or the wrong color, they might have babies that are speckled or spotted in the wrong color. So I'm going to eliminate the chance that Jacob has a head start here. Somehow Laban always seems to try to cheat Jacob from the get-go by tipping the scales in his favor. So he's doing the same thing again. He intends to make sure that Jacob does not have any potential help on the front end. But here's what Laban doesn't understand, that God will bless when he has promised to bless, and he will show favor to those he has promised to favor, the ones who belong to him. Okay, back to our text. My time is flying. Genesis 30, verses 37 through 43. Now Jacob took for himself rods of green poplar and of the almond and chestnut trees, peeled white strips in them, and exposed the white which was in the rods. And the rods which he had peeled he set before the flocks in the gutters, in the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink, so that they could conceive when they came to drink. So the flocks conceived before the rods, and the flocks brought forth streaked, speckled, and spotted. Then Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face toward the streaked and all the brown in the flock of Laban. But he put his own flocks by themselves and did not put them with Laban's flock. And it came to pass, whenever the stronger livestock conceived, that Jacob placed the rods before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the flocks were feeble, he did not put them in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger were Jacob's. Thus the man became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. Okay, to us, that is very strange, and it's very easy for us to understand what Jacob seems to be doing here. I don't think at all that what he's doing is based in superstition. Apparently, in his own way, he's showing a kind of practical in-shoe leather faith, because we know that God designed laws of genetics and that God set those things into place. But at that point in time, there would have been almost nothing known about genetics as a science. Certainly not. But Jacob knew what his father-in-law had done. He understood from the beginning that given any opportunity, Laban's going to cheat me. So he's doing what he believes will protect his interests, and on some scale, in some way, indicate that he's putting his trust in God to balance the scales. Now, Laban most definitely should not have counted Jacob out. Jacob actually, over the course of not just the rest of our time today, but even the beginning of our time next time, is going to use 3 very unusual means of potentially outwitting his uncle. First, he takes some branches and he strips portions of the bark off the branches and exposes white streaks on the inner portions of the branches to sight so that they are visible. Now, the logic is he's going to place these streaked or partially stripped branches in the watering holes, the watering places for these animals near the wells where they're watered, so that when they breed, that there will be these partially stripped branches in their line of sight. And he thinks that prenatal influence will lead to striped, speckled, and spotted offspring being born to these animals. Now, we know that's not how genetics works. We understand that. Jacob is simply doing this as an act of belief that God's going to balance the scales. He also separated the spotted, striped lambs, the kids that don't have the right coloring, from the herd, but he kept them in plain view of his ewes. Now, this is not day one when that initial separation occurred. This is as things progress. And so he sets up what he believes will assist in this process of animals being born of the right coloration. Thirdly, he also selects the strongest animals to use these streaked branches with, because he does not want the offspring of the weaker animals. They will not produce offspring that are as strong. So he has set in place this plan that he believes will give him strong animals that are colored the right way. And here's what's interesting. Though genetics doesn't work that way, God intervenes and supernaturally influences the entire breeding process in terms of what these animals are producing. We have to assume that it's happening that way for one of 2 reasons. Either because God has already promised to bless Jacob, and what God blesses, nobody can curse, or God is looking on Jacob's diligence, his service of Laban, his actions that he believes will help things, as acts of faith, not as doubt. So the tide is turning, and God allows animals, strong animals, to be born that will be colored in such a way that they will belong to Jacob. Okay, that takes us back to our text. Now we begin Genesis chapter 31, and we will look at the first 16 verses. Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has acquired all this wealth. In other words, Jacob is stealing from our father and from our inheritance. And Jacob saw the countenance of Laban, and indeed it was not favorable toward him as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, Return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field to his flock. Notice, Zilpah and Bilhah are not included in discussions of that kind. And he says to Rachel and Leah, I see your father's countenance, that is, it is not favorable toward me as before, but the God of my father has been with me, and you know that with all my might I have served your father. Yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God did not allow him to hurt me. Now, all this wishy-washy changing things around is not recorded in Scripture, but we have evidence that it occurred. If he said thus, the speckled shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore speckled. And if he said thus, the streaked shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked. So God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. That's a plain statement. And it happened at the time when the flocks conceived that I lifted my eyes and saw in a dream, and behold, the rams which leaped upon the flocks were streaked, speckled, and gray spotted. Then the angel of God spoke to me in a dream, saying, Jacob. And I said, Here I am. And he said, Lift up your eyes now and see. All the rams which leap on the flocks are streaked, speckled, and gray spotted. For I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now arise, get out of this land and return to the land of your family. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, Is there still any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not considered strangers by him? For he has sold us. Interesting statement. And also completely consumed our money. Note that. For all these riches which God has taken from our father are really ours and our children's. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do it. So, okay, Laban has continued his scheming. That text clearly shows it. Manipulation and wishy-washy changes and deceitfulness. But God's blessings have overridden all of Jacob's scheming. Laban's scheming. And the result is that Laban and his sons are now disgruntled and resentful. And his sons are actually accusing Laban of stealing their father's wealth in order to make himself rich. So the relationship between Jacob and his uncle Laban and these descendants of Laban, who are his cousins, it's imploding. It's deteriorating. So Jacob senses, having heard accusations that are that damaging, that there is hostility and that it's mounting and that he needs to do something. Now, by this point, Jacob has enough. He doesn't need anything else to be able to provide for his family. In fact, he's a rich man. So when God gives him a direct and clear instruction to return home, in verse 3, there is no reason why Jacob should really question that other than the things he knows he will face when he goes home. Remember what verse 3 said. Then the Lord said to Jacob, Return to the land of your fathers and to your family. But here's that promise attached, and I will be with you. By this point, 20 years have passed. Jacob served 14 years for 2 wives, 7 for each one, including the one he didn't want. And now he has served Laban 6 years for animals and flocks and herds. It's time to go home. If he's ever going home, it's time to go. Now, he has no way of knowing exactly what may have changed at home. He doesn't know that Rachel is now dead. He doesn't know that. I'm sure that would have been a source of great pain for him had he known that he missed. But remember, we talked about the fact when Jacob had to flee that there were high price tags attached to what had been done. So Jacob calls Rachel and Leah to the field where his flock is, and he tells them, Look, your father no longer views me in a favorable light at all. Not at all. I started off in a place of favor, but I'm not there anymore. And it's time for us to go home to Canaan. Now, God was with him, had always been with him. But the situation with Laban does deserve some consideration here. So he reminds them that he has served their father faithfully with all his strength and all his might, diligently doing what was right and what benefited Laban greatly. Their father changed his wages, deceived him, tried to cheat him, and the number 10 times was in there. Now, we shouldn't really take that number literally. Probably that means one time after another, he just constantly vacillated and switched things around. So Jacob has been the victim of attempted deception again, over and over again, as Laban tried to stop the shift in wealth from himself to Jacob that God was obviously facilitating. But despite Laban's efforts, God had shown favor and prevented the schemes of Laban from having a negative effect on Jacob. Now, verse 9 is actually clear enough to say that God has taken Laban's wealth and transferred it to Jacob. Verse 10 suggests that God gave Jacob a dream or vision that validated his choice of choosing unusually colored animals as his wages in a divine revelation. Wow. God's favor, and God's direction. God, give us the wisdom to seek your direction, to not run barreling through life making choices that have great impact without knowing your will. So in this vision or dream that Jacob had while he was actually in the fields before the animals would conceive, God identifies himself to Jacob. Now, the first time he appeared to Jacob at Bethel, he identified himself in connection to the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac. Remember that? Now he identifies himself as the God of Bethel. I don't have to introduce myself to you for the first time anymore. We've met before. Now, even though the term angel was used here, this is obviously a divine appearance. I can't tell you whether it's God himself or it's a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. I'm not going to have that debate. But clearly, God is in a dream appearing to Jacob, providing direction that will benefit Jacob financially. And now he has spoken to Jacob and told him to go home. Now, Rachel and Leah both affirm this decision and endorse Jacob's decision to return home. Obviously, along the way, they've lost respect for their father. I mean, why wouldn't they? Because every time he tries to cheat Jacob, he's cheating them and their children. This section also seems to point to this idea that even though Jacob worked 14 years for Rachel and Leah, somehow in the transaction, there should have been bride's gifts, bride's wealth, something transferred to them that they never received. They got nothing from Laban for free, and it really wasn't for free, except their 2 maidservants, because Jacob worked 14 years for them. The feelings of these women toward their father and toward the situation are abundantly clear, especially in verse 15. Are we not considered strangers by him? He treats us like foreigners. He has sold us and also completely consumed our money. So he sold us. You worked a long time for us, and goods and money that we should have received never came with us in this process. So both Rachel and Leah indicate that everything that God has transferred to Jacob is justified and rightfully belongs to them through him. Remember, women didn't own property, but we should have received those things to benefit us and to benefit our children. So their response to Jacob is, do what God has told you to do. Now, even though God shows favor to Jacob, and he has blessed Jacob, not everything is right in Jacob's house at this point, in his household, among his family members. Not everything is spiritually quite where it ought to be. Now, a short section, Genesis 31:17 through 24. Then Jacob rose and set his sons and his wives on camels, and he carried away all his livestock and all his possessions which he had gained, his acquired livestock which he had gained in Padanaram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. Now Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the household idols that were her father's. And Jacob stole away unknown to Laban the Syrian, in that he did not tell him that he intended to flee. So he fled with all that he had. He arose and crossed the river and headed toward the mountains of Gilead. So Jacob organizes, gets his flocks and herds all together, gets his possessions collected, gets his children ready for a long journey. Now, as I've said, it possibly could have been 450 miles. Some will argue that if he traveled a straight route, maybe 300 miles, but who knows how he wandered and exactly what route he took so that he could get a large, very large caravan with a lot of people and a lot of property to his ultimate destination in Canaan. Now, it's clear that Jacob picked an opportune time to basically sneak away, to set out for Canaan. Laban is gone to a sheep shearing festival. Now, we know he didn't go out and shear all the sheep himself. So it had to have been that celebration gathering at the end of shearing time. So that gave Jacob and his large caravan a little window of time to leave before Laban figured out what was happening. So before they left, Rachel took her father's household gods. Now, we have no idea exactly what motivated her to do that, to steal these teraphim. They were small household idols or images because people thought they brought protection. They thought that they could be used in divination, and they were even sometimes associated with this idea of a private priesthood. Now, they did vary greatly in size, though some of them, in fact, probably more of them, were on the small side. They could be more like life-sized images or figures, and these kinds of figures are mentioned a number of times in Scripture. If you go back and look, Michal, the daughter of Saul, who became David's wife, put some of these teraphim in David's bed and covered them up to make it look like David was still in his bed pretending to be sick, when in fact he was escaping. That's 1 Samuel 19 verses 13 through 16, describing when he ran from Saul. They're associated with a man named Micah and his role as a private priest. That's in Judges 17:5. Prophets like Zechariah and Samuel warned against them as symbols of false worship and superstition and anti-God in their very nature. And young King Josiah banned and removed them from among the people. So here's the thing. We don't know why Rachel did it. Is she ridiculing the fact that her father worships idols and taking them for that reason? Or is she taking them because she's still connected to that native religion of idol worship? I don't know. Maybe she took them because she thought they were made of valuable materials and she deserved them. So she took them as stealing wealth in another way. Maybe she just thought she was entitled to take something. I don't know. But there is no way that Jacob knew what she was doing. Maybe she thought Jacob deserved them and she took them. But despite whatever her motives were, it was wrong. The end could not have justified the means ever. She was not only stealing, but that was going to lead to more deception as we continue this story. That's just a reminder. God's laws are given for a good reason, and we do better when we follow them. So until you join me for the continuation of this story and the results of her actions, I pray that you walk in God's laws and in God's favor. Until I see you next time, God bless.